Why Texas needs spending limit reform. We released this paper today, and we believe that there's opportunity for improvement there. As you know, the Texas model of low taxes, no personal income tax, less regulation, and a good lawsuit environment has contributed to much of the success that Texas has realized. And what does the data show on the spending? When you take a look at this last session, the 84th, the legislature passed a 2016-17 budget, all funds of $209.4 billion. This is a 69% increase since 2004 and 5, and it's 8.8% above the key metric that we use of population plus inflation, and which accounts for about $16.9 billion over what it would have been had such a limit been in place and adhered to in 2003. You remember, most of you probably weren't born then, but back in 1978, a spending limit was passed by the voters. Article 8, Section 22 said, "In no biennium shall the rate of growth of appropriation from state tax revenues not dedicated by the Constitution exceed the estimated rate of growth of the state's economy." And then the legislators put in place that said that estimate will be the projected growth in personal income. Well, what's the key flaws of that system? As we see it, first of all, less than half of the budget is under the limit. And then the measure establishing the budget limit's growth, it's measured by personal income, a projection of personal income. If you try to project the price of gasoline a week out, you have a problem doing that. So when you are looking at personal income growth in the state of Texas, it's a hit or miss situation. And then you have to project out almost 3 years, or around 33 months with that. So we believe that if you apply the growth rate to all funds, if you use the metric of population plus inflation, personal income, or gross state product, whichever is less, and then require supermajority vote of each chamber to exceed the limit, then you would have a better growth rate. And the 84th legislature proved that the reform could actually come into play, including all funds. What we found that the budget that they passed was an all funds increase of about 3.6%, well under the 6.5% that we calculated the previous 2 years of population plus inflation. And if you looked at, if you had those limits in place, we would have found that Texas families of 4 would enjoy about $1,261 less money that they would have to pony up than they do today. Have we always, since 78, 81, adopted a growth rate? Back in 1991, out of frustration, raised the question with our conservative coalition, which I was president of at that time, of what can we do about this idea of spending all the money coming into a session when we don't have enough funds to cover what the spending rate that the legislature has become accustomed to. You raise taxes, more money comes in than projected, and you spend that down. And I asked the staff to go away and look and say, what is it that we can do to get a handle on that? And I thought I'd given them probably a 6-week project. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, they came back in about 2 hours and said, we don't have to do anything. All the LBB has to do is do what the Constitution and statute tells them to do. Well, lo and behold, in 1987, 89, and 91, a growth rate had not been adopted. Now, staff did their job. They presented the numbers to the budget board, but they just did not act on it. Well, we filed a writ of mandamus, which that's the cover sheet, with the Supreme Court. I think there was about 20 legislators, a couple of citizens, and it's interesting to note that none of those legislators are in the legislature anymore. I don't know that that had anything to do with it or not, but when you attack your leadership of both houses, you're not endeared to them for very long. But at any rate, the Supreme Court refused to hear it, but we did put in law in a special session of that year that if a growth rate is not adopted, it is presumed to be zero. The good news is, at that time, Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock said, as long as I'm Lieutenant Governor, we'll always adopt a growth rate. He was good to his word. I'm not saying that what we put in the statute had anything to do with it, but at any rate, we've had a growth rate adopted ever since that time. Well, we'll be talking about that and what happens in other states and countries, and what do we need to do going forward, along with the historical background of what happens with the growth rate and really how it is administered. And to kick that conversation off, we have Ursula Parks, the director of the Texas Legislative Budget Board. She's been on the staff of LBB since 1993. During her tenure, Ms. Parks has worked in various capacities, including budget analyst, a budget team manager, an assistant director, and the agency's deputy director. Ms. Parks has been directly involved in the development of budget policy recommendations for numerous state agencies, institutions, with all state government functions for much of her finance. She is not only a big picture state fiscal policy person, but she deals with developing details of the state appropriations. She is a lifelong Austinite and holds a bachelor's degree from American University. Help me welcome Ursula Parks.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here to talk about the importance of spending limits. I will say that as Talmadge mentioned, ever since we had that little run of limits not getting adopted for a little spate of years in the early 90s, we have adopted one for every session thereafter. And I do think that the threat of the limit being zero does definitely play a role in that, knowing what the alternative is. I'm going to briefly cover the various constitutional limitations on state spending, and in particular the basic mechanics of the Article 8 limit that is generally referred to as the state spending limit. And I'll also cover some conceptual discussion around some of the conversations that have happened around changing or revising that limit. I'll start off by saying that the topic of this meeting is do limits matter? And in my opinion, yes, they do. They do matter. I think they inform the conversation. They provide some parameters around the discussion that happens in shaping state appropriations. And I think that they really have the most relevance when everybody affected by them and involved in the decision-making process and having that conversation really understand what they do and do not control. And all of these limits operate in a little bit of a different way. And so we'll start off by briefly reviewing those. So the Texas Constitution actually includes 4 limitations on state spending. Most of us talk in general about the last 2 on that list, but there are 4. The first 2 are focused on very particular types of spending, and then the last 2 have very broad application to state appropriations. And as noted on the bottom, the spoiler alert is that the 16-17 budget is within all of the 4 constitutional limits. The first one that I'll briefly touch on is the debt limit. This is in Article 3 of the Constitution. So this is the constitutional debt limit. It's more commonly referred to as the CDL. And it just generally limits the amount of debt service that may be paid from general revenue. So it's very, very specific, it's very targeted. We remain within this limit. I think at the end of 13, the ratio of debt service to issued debt was about 1.34%. So we're well within that. That was adopted, that's the most recent of the provisions. It was adopted in 1997. The second that I'll briefly touch on is the welfare spending limit. This was adopted in 1945. It's been in the Constitution since then, although in different incarnations, it's actually been part of the function of Texas as a state and as an entity, even preceding its adoption in the Constitution in 1945. The welfare spending limit is applied to cash assistance only. Texas does very little in the way of cash assistance, and it has always been interpreted simply as cash assistance. And as you can see, it's grants on behalf of needy dependent children and their caretakers. So it's calculated based on the amount of TANF cash assistance that is appropriated. Also, as Talmadge noted, the 16-17 all funds budget is about $209 billion, which would lead a welfare spending limit of about $2.1 billion. TANF appropriations are under $100 million, so we're well within that one as well. The third one that I'll touch on is the first of the big two that really have very broad application to all appropriations and state spending. This is the Article 3 pay-as-you-go limit. And this is essentially the limit that prevents the state from deficit spending. We can only pay out, what the controller estimates we're going to take in. This is the oldest of the limits. It was adopted in 1942. And I think, it's not hard to imagine the social, economic, political atmosphere that was happening in Texas in 1942 that led to the adoption of this. There are a number of things that are and are not controlled by the pay-as-you-go limit. I'm not gonna cover all of this. One thing that I'll point out about PAYGO is that while our office and the legislature in general tracks appropriations and revenues and sort of where the state is relative to the pay-as-you-go limit, the pay-as-you-go limit is absolutely in the purview of the controller of public accounts. This is one of those, checks and balances in state government that the pay-as-you-go limit and our relationship to it and certification under it is absolutely the controller's responsibility and not a function of the legislature. When we commonly talk about this limit, what we're talking about are GR revenues coming into the Treasury, plus beginning balances in GR and balances in general revenue dedicated. I'll point out that funds that are classified as other funds, so not general revenue, are not subject to the pay-as-you-go limit. This would include things like the Economic Stabilization Fund, which is an other fund, the State Highway Fund, Mobility Fund, Property Tax Relief Fund. There are pretty significant appropriations associated with many of these. Appropriations from the ESF are very volatile, and there are none in the 16-17 budget, although there's a really significant balance waiting in the state treasury should we ever need to tap it. But by comparison, the State Highway Fund is worth about $12 billion, Mobility just under another billion, and PTRF $3 billion, and none of those are subject to the general revenue calculation under the pay-as-you-go limit. The one we're really talking about today and focused on is the spending limit. So this one also, as Talmadge said, is really in two parts. There's a constitutional provision and there's a statutory provision. Constitutional adoption of the spending limit did happen in 1978 and was really part of a package of amendments that were offered to the voters in response to a taxpayer revolt that was happening at the time. So there was a lot of concern among taxpayers in the state of Texas that the state's ability to pay out of the Treasury was far outpacing taxpayers' ability to funnel revenue into the Treasury. So there were a number of provisions that were put into place as part of this package to address that. It was designed to focus on state tax revenues, again, in response to this real taxpayer-driven initiative that really was about their ability to pay taxes. And so other revenues, fees, fines, penalties, those kinds of revenues that are not generated in quite the same way as state tax revenue are not part of it. And it's very specifically linked to the estimated rate of growth in the state economy. I'll note that at the time, in the late 70s and in the run-up to adoption of this package of amendments, Texas was doing really well. It was particularly doing well relative to the rest of the country. Personal income growth was pretty strong, ranged from about 11% to just under 16% in the preceding handful of years. Consumer inflation was around 7%. at the time, and we had very strong job growth, particularly compared to the rest of the country. This all sounds a little familiar, right? Texas with the strong economy, really strong economic indicators, in particular when compared to what was going on nationwide. Texas GDP far outpaced, that of the country in the run-up to this package of amendments. So I think it's important to just understand the context that this developed out of. The amendment that was offered to the voters not only had the spending limit in it, it also had, wait for it, a homestead exemption, the agricultural valuation exemption that is in place now. That was part of this package of amendments in the late 70s. There were also some truth in taxation and property tax administration provisions. I think that when this package was debated in the legislature, there was actually discussion around whether or not a very strict limitation on the growth and property tax appraisal could be put into place. But that was not part of the final package that was brought before the voters in 78. So there's also this portion of the spending limit that is, it went away. There we go. That is in the Government Code. So Government Code Chapter 316. The Constitution delegates certain authority to the legislature in administration of the spending limit. And it's important to understand which of these provisions are constitutional versus statutory, especially when we talk about changing the limit. What tool needs to be used to do that. The Constitution demands that the limit be based on the estimated rate of growth in the state economy. Statute, on the other hand, defines that as personal income and has done so since the outset. I'll note that the 16-17 budget retains about $2 billion in capacity under the spending limit that was adopted actually a year ago today. We had an LVB meeting on December 1st of last year. Just as only certain appropriations are controlled by the pay-as-you-go limit, only certain appropriations are controlled by the spending limit. It's not everything. It is, again, as Talmadge noted, it is a subset of appropriations. And I think this is a place where there can be a lot of discussion and some amount of confusion, so I want to try to be as clear as I can on this. The spending limit cares about how appropriated revenue is generated. The spending limit does not care how that revenue is deposited. It does not care how it's expended. The spending limit is completely agnostic on those questions. The spending limit really only cares about whether or not the revenue is state tax revenue and that it is not otherwise dedicated by the Constitution. There's a misconception that it applies solely and entirely to general revenue, and this is not the case. For example, lottery proceeds are general revenue. Lottery proceeds are not state tax revenue. There's a joke about what they are a tax on, but it is not state tax revenue. And therefore it is not subject to the spending limit. The available school fund, one of the tools we use to support public education, is general revenue, but the revenue stream for that is constitutionally dedicated, and so it is not subject to the spending limit. The Economic Stabilization Fund, as I noted earlier, is another fund. It is not general revenue. It's deposited to other funds. It is, however, subject to the spending limit because its revenue stream is undedicated state tax revenue. So the ESF is one of those great examples of differential treatment of revenue streams between the pay-as-you-go limit and the spending limit. Not subject to pay-as-you-go, but it is subject to the spending limit. I'll just briefly touch on the process that happens for the LBB adoption of the limit. We, as staff, we solicit estimates from a variety of economic forecast houses for rates of personal income growth, and we look at those and we present them to our board, and the board adopts one. So I like to be as clear as I can, especially around this, on the difference between what the staff does, and Talmadge did a nice job of this earlier, differentiating the role of the LBB staff in establishment of the spending limit versus the role of the actual elected members of the LBB in establishing the spending limit. And it's the members of the board who actually adopt the limit. The one that was adopted a year ago was 11.68 as the estimated rate of growth in the Texas economy. I will say this was the lowest of the estimates that were provided to us from everyone that submitted, and it was also the one provided by the Controller of Public Accounts. It's not uncommon for the Controller's estimate to be one of the lower ones, and it's pretty common for it to be the adopted forecast. The level of appropriations in the 14-15 biennium from state tax revenue not dedicated by the Constitution was estimated to be about $84 billion. And so the resulting math of 11.68 times 84.4 yields, that $94.3 billion referenced in the slide. A question we get asked a lot is whether or not the limit ever changes. And the answer to that is that the adopted rate of growth does not change. So the rate of growth that the board adopts, that 11.68, that's pretty immutable. That stays in place, that is fixed for the life of the spending limit. But what can change is the amount and mix of revenue supporting those appropriations. So as we come through and we do maybe a supplemental spending bill, that's going to shift things. As changes come through on the revenue estimate, that will change what the actual capacity is under the spending limit. I will note that it's only in recent years that we've been in a situation where the spending and pay-as-you-go limits have been very close to one another. It's typically the case that one is very strongly controlling and the other one nobody even really talks about because we're not even going to get close to that. So we're either in a place where, and this is more commonly the place, where we are more constrained by the pay-as-you-go limit. We're just simply constrained by how much revenue is available, more constrained by that than by how much we can grow from one biennium to the next. It is more common for those two points to be separated, and you can understand why that would be, given economic fluctuations, how one might be more controlling in a period where maybe we're coming out of recession, versus a period of more stability. As I noted, it is more common, particularly during session, for the pay-go limit to be the controlling limit. But that can certainly change, and it can change very dramatically, particularly with respect to changing revenues. If balances change significantly, that can shift. The other question that we get asked a lot is, can the limit be exceeded? And the answer to that is also yes. It takes a majority of each chamber to pass a concurrent resolution. That is what is required, is a concurrent resolution to exceed the limit. I will note this has only happened once. The legislature has only acted once to exceed the spending limit, and it was, as noted, I didn't flip you over, sorry about that. Here we go. It was in 2007 when the legislature acted to do a quite significant effort around property tax relief, and was making an appropriation of over $14 billion to replace the lost local revenue associated with that. That was such a significant increase in appropriations, and it was not within the bounds of the spending limit that had been adopted, and the legislature voted to exceed the limit that one time in 2007 to accommodate property tax relief. There have been a number of proposals to revise the spending limit. I kind of boil them down into three general categories, and they can happen in concert, one or the other, or a combination of the above. The first might be a change to a rate. So the rate of economic growth could be changed in statute away from personal income. And proposals that have been discussed include shifting maybe to a gross state product, to compounded population and consumer inflation, working with the CPI, or the lesser of one or the other of those. And again, Talmadge mentioned this. Another possibility would be changes to the base, so changing how much of the state budget is subject, to the spending limit. And that has certainly been discussed. The limit now applies to a little less than half of the all funds budget. But nearly 70% of the GR, GRD, and other funds budgets. Once you exclude federal funds, it actually controls a great deal more of the total budget. I will note that in 16-17, the all funds budget grew by less than 4%. We had some declines in federal and other funds, in part, that drove that. The GR, GRD, and other funds budget grew by about 5.8%. There are also ideas that have been discussed to exclude certain kinds of spending from the spending limit, which I think that's a little confusing, but as I noted earlier, the spending limit actually doesn't care about how the money is spent. It cares about how the revenue was generated. But there have been discussions to, for example, exempt appropriations that might be tied to tax relief. Increased appropriations associated with the homestead exemption, for example. But that is not currently the case. That was a component of SJR2 this last session that talked about excluding from the spending limit any appropriation that was a rebate of state taxes. So that idea was certainly out there last session. One other thing that I would just note is that compounded population times consumer inflation that was available last fall, so when the spending limit was adopted, ranged from about 6.4 to 8.3%. Those were the ranges that were available. The BRE had a forecast of about 5.8%. So in January, that was the controller's estimate of population, compounded population and inflation, which is actually right around, as I just noted, right around where the GR and other funds budget fell. It was right about that point. There are also proposals that were out there to have differential rates of growth, so to apply a different rate of growth to what we're spending in public education versus transportation versus health. And I would say that that what's discussed on that side is this idea that the basket of goods that we as consumers buy is pretty different from the basket of goods that state government buys. It is further differentiated when you really get down to those very specific functions of state government. So healthcare, for example, has a very different rate of inflation, than consumer inflation does. And that was a feature of the House version of Senate Bill 9 this last session. And the last piece that I'll just reference is this time frame idea, which I think Talmadge also mentioned, which would be this idea of shifting from doing a projection of economic growth to applying a previous biennium's actual rate of growth prospectively and doing it that way, or perhaps taking an average of a couple of biennia. And I think that was certainly in the Senate version of Senate Bill 9 this last session. So there are a lot of ideas around this, and they certainly have profoundly different ramifications on the state budget, and ones that would really also shift dramatically from session to session, depending on what the pressures and demands on each given legislature are, which can vary quite dramatically, as some of these guys know better than I do. So that concludes my prepared remarks, and I think you want to do questions at the end, right? Instead of now, so y'all can think about what those questions are and hit me up at the end. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Mitchell, who is a senior fellow who specializes in fiscal policy, particularly tax reform, international tax competition, and the economic burden of government spending. He also serves on the editorial board of the Cayman Financial Review. Prior to joining Cato, Mitchell was a senior fellow with the Heritage Foundation and an economist for Senator Robert Packwood and the Senate Finance Committee. Dan's work's been published in numerous outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Villanova Law Review, Public Choice, Emory Law Journal, Forbes, USA Today, Offshore Investment, and Investors Daily Business. He's appeared in all the major TV networks and has given speeches in almost 40 states and over 30 countries. Dan earned a PhD in economics from George Mason University. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Mitchell.
Thank you, Talmadge. It's good to be out of the Beltway and out in the real world. And I just listening to Ursula's comments, I saw a difference between Texas and Washington. You've had your spending limits for quite a while, and you said, if I understand correctly, you've only busted them once. We've had the Budget Control Act in Washington only since 2011, and already Republicans and Democrats have conspired to bust the spending caps 2 times. So I don't know whether that means our politicians are more efficient or whether Texas politicians are simply better. But what I want to do in my remarks is, first of all, to get across what I think is the goal of having a spending cap, and then talk a little bit about what we can see from the international evidence about how these things should work. So let's get right into it. And I suppose, as I said, we have to figure out what is it we're trying to achieve. Are we trying to balance budgets, or are we trying to shrink government? Now, certainly, in terms of at least the Washington debate, there's always discussion about what's happening to the deficit, what's happening to the national debt. But as you'll see in my presentation, I think that's the symptom. And what we should be focusing on when we're talking about fiscal reforms and fiscal rules is what we can do to control the size of government, because that's what drives other things such as the tax burden and the impact on red ink. And to make that case, I guess the first thing I want to do is just say that balanced budget rules usually don't work very well. We have balanced budget rules of some kind, ranging from strong constitutional limits to simply statutory limits in 49 out of 50 states. Do those stop some states from spending too much money? No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I've always been worried that if we ever did get a balanced budget amendment in Washington, the main effect would be that the politicians would say we're now constitutionally obligated to raise taxes. So a lot of people who are worried about government being too big, they support balanced budget amendments, but it's not clear that balanced budget amendments would actually do anything to control the size of government. And you see the same thing in Europe. They have what's called these Maastricht rules in Europe. And these Maastricht rules, in theory, limit government debt to 60% of GDP and deficits to 3% of GDP. Has that stopped excessive spending? For that matter, has it even stopped red ink in Europe? No, it doesn't work at all. And keep in mind that a 3% of GDP deficit rule is just like a balanced budget rule. It's a limit as that, in one case, the limit is 0 deficit each year. In the other case, the limit is 3% of GDP deficit every year. But in neither case are you stopping governments from spending too much money if that is your goal, and I'm going to argue that that should be the goal. In the United States, balanced budget rules don't stop politicians in places like New Jersey, Illinois, California, and New York from spending too much money. And these Maastricht rules in Europe don't stop Greece and Italy and Spain and Sweden and France from spending a lot of money. And I think one of the problems when we ask ourselves, well, why is it that these balanced budget rules don't really work? And if you look at the details, there's a boom-bust cycle. It doesn't even have to be boom-bust cycle, but there's just an economic cycle where in some years, when your economy is doing reasonably well, what's an effect of that? Well, an effect of an economy doing reasonably well is that it's going to generate a lot of tax revenue. And if you look at the details from different countries and different states, you will see periods where it's not unusual for tax revenues to be coming in at 8% a year, or some cases even 10% a year or more, when the economy is growing at a reasonable clip. But what happens when the economy is growing like that and you have a balanced budget rule? Well, the politicians are saying, hey, this is great. We're getting revenues coming in at 8% a year, 10% a year. What do? They start spending 8% a year or 10% a year. But the problem is good times don't last forever. And so when you have a recession or even just a period of economic stagnation, all of a sudden the revenues fall off. But you've had all these politicians during the good years, they were making all these spending commitments, and usually the spending commitments aren't one-time things. Oh, we have a lot of revenue this year, so let's do a one-time spending program for X, Y, or Z. No, they create programs that in theory are going to result in obligations to spend money in the future, or at least create the expectation and the desire and anticipation among the interest groups that benefit from that spending that they're going to get more outlays in future years. And so what happens when you get the recession and all of a sudden the revenues go down, the politicians are then, by the balanced budget rules, they're forced to do something about it, at least to some degree, and oftentimes they do these so-called balanced packages. Oh, we're going to do half spending cuts, we're going to do half tax increases. But what that results in is a ratchet effect. Spending goes up during the good years, it's cut back a little bit in the bad years, then it goes up again in the good years, comes down a little bit in the bad years, and the end result after 30, 40, 50 years is you wind up with a much, much bigger burden of government spending than there was at the beginning. That's certainly part of the experience that we see in Europe and in Washington. But let me stop for a second here and explain why I think government spending is the problem. And I'm saying this in the context of where governments are today. I suppose even in my libertarian fantasy world, there might be such a thing as government that's too small, but I don't really have that challenge of identifying that government that exists today because I don't think there is one. Even in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, where governments consume about 20% of economic output, that's still about double the size of government that there was in the United States back in the 1800s, where total federal, state, and local spending was under 10% of GDP on average. So I don't know that there's any government that's too small in the world today, but I know there are lots of governments that are too big. And when I say governments are too big, I'm not simply saying that the taxes to finance those governments are too high, although that oftentimes is the case. What I'm saying is that the governments are too big in that they are diverting too many resources from the productive sector of the economy. And if those resources were left in the productive sector of the economy, you would get more growth, more prosperity, whereas when the resources are transferred to government, the money doesn't tend to get spent as well. And so I think there is an unambiguous case that governments in general, all around the world, among the U.S. states, in Washington, no matter where you're looking, Governments today are too big, but that's only part of the bad news. The really worrisome news is because of demographic changes, aging populations and things like that, not to mention an erosion of social capital, a growing belief that it's okay to try to just live off the government, I'm very, very worried about where we're heading in the long run. And so as a result, when I'm thinking about spending caps, I really have two goals. First, I want to somehow try to stop that future spending increase from happening that's already baked into the cake. And then, ideally, I want to figure out some way to gradually shrink the burden of government spending relative to the productive sector of the economy. And again, keep in mind, it's the government spending that we should consider as the real problem, and then things like red ink and rising tax burdens are symptoms of the problem. Here's the analogy I use when I talk to people in Washington. Let's say I have some really severe headaches, and eventually it gets so bad, I go to the doctor, and the doctor does all those MRIs and CAT scans and things like that, and the doctor comes back to me and says, Dan, you have a brain tumor. Do I then say to the doctor, well, can you give me some aspirin for these headaches? Well, maybe I do, because it's no fun to have the headaches, but guess what I'm going to be far more worried about? I'm going to be far more worried about the fact that there's a brain tumor. And I say, Doc, figure out some way to get rid of that brain tumor, and if I get rid of that brain tumor, guess what? The headaches go away. In other words, one's the disease, one's the symptom of the disease. So the solution is spending caps. Now the question is, how do you do it? And there are several options out there. There are Tabor-type rules, which is spending growing at inflation plus population, or some other formula. There's formulaic spending caps, and Tabor, of course, is just a version of that. There are GDP-related spending caps, which I'm not a big fan of because there's just too many games that can be played in terms of projecting GDP. But I guess in Texas, you're doing a pretty good job on projecting income growth, but I don't trust the people in Washington to do it correctly. And then you have constitutional restrictions. And I want to point out that we have had periods in the United States, in Washington, where spending has been constrained. Here's a map looking at federal government spending in nominal dollars from 2000 until 2014. You can see during the Bush years and the early Obama years, we had a spending binge. Government was growing very, very rapidly. But then all of a sudden, starting in 2009, admittedly a very high base because of the so-called stimulus and TARP and things like that, but for 5 years from 2009 to 2014, we had a nominal spending freeze in Washington. So all those fights about debt limits and sequesters and government shutdowns, they actually paid off. That's the good news. The bad news is that spending is growing much, much faster than population and inflation for 2015, and it's likely to be growing much, much faster in 2016. So in other words, every so often you get good policy, but the real challenge is how do you have sustained long-run good policy? You could probably find a period in French fiscal history where they had government growing pretty slowly for a couple of years. But that hasn't stopped France from now having a government burden of more than 50% of GDP and becoming an economic basket case. So it's not simply having good policy for a few years, it's what sort of rules or policies will give you good policy in the long run. By the way, here's another chart on what happened during the last 5 years. Who would have thought when Obama first got elected that he would preside over the biggest 5-year reduction in the burden of government spending since the end of World War II? Now, not because he wanted this outcome. If you look at his early budget, he wanted spending to grow on top of the TARP and on top of the stimulus, but the changes in the 2010 elections and all those fights that I mentioned, they did make a difference. And it's not just in Washington. Here's a chart, a table, not a chart. You probably won't be able to read it unless your eyes are better than mine, but I went through the IMF World Economic Database, and I found examples of countries that for multi-year periods had government spending, that sort of middle column there, had government spending growing less than 2% a year in nominal terms. And what happened when government grew 2% a year or less in nominal terms? Well, you look over the next column, you see what happened to the burden of government spending as a share of GDP. It fell. And then if you look at the far right column, which is deficits as a share of GDP, you see that if you deal with the underlying problem of government being too big and you reduce government as a share of GDP, you necessarily reduce red ink as a share of GDP. In other words, what I said before, you cure the disease and the symptoms go away. But again, the same point I made about what happened in Washington, you'll notice that in just about all these countries, there's an end point. They had fiscal responsibility, spending restraint for a handful of years, and then they fell off the wagon. So the real question, again, isn't whether or not you get good policy for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, is what can you do to make it sustainable in the long run? And that's an enforcement issue. I already mentioned that the Budget Control Act spending caps have been violated 2 times. It's very hard to be optimistic about the success and the strength of budget caps when they can be violated. Well, why were they violated? Well, first of all, they only applied to discretionary spending, so the biggest part of the budget, entitlements, were completely left untouched. And then there was a bias against the defense budget. It's only 20% of federal outlays, but it took 50% of the sequester hit. And so Republicans, who might otherwise have been okay with the BCA and the spending caps, got very, very squeamish about letting them actually take effect, and that's been one of the big political dynamics in having the BCA get weakened 2 times already. But let's keep in mind, if you have a no-tax environment, any sort of fiscal rule, in theory, could restrain spending. If you go back to Graham-Rudman-Hollings in the late 1980s, that was actually a deficit target, not a spending target. But if you don't allow tax increases, a deficit target, in effect, is a spending target. Because what you're allowed to spend as a politician is the total amount of revenue that's projected to come in plus the allowable deficit. So under Graham-Rudman, we actually did have a spending cap because Reagan wasn't allowing taxes to go up. But of course, what happened? Once it began to bite, once the enforcement challenge kicked in, it was then eviscerated as part of the read my lips tax increase budget deal in 1990. Now, by the way, that tax increase budget deal in 1990 had spending caps in it. But those spending caps didn't achieve anything. They were like 90-mile-an-hour speed limits in a school zone. They were spending caps, but they basically said, you used to spend this much more each year, now you get to spend this much more each year. So the question is, what are we trying to deal with? Government spending. What do we want to do with government spending? In theory, we want to shrink it relative to the economy, and that means not only do you need spending caps, but they have to be enforceable, and they have to be designed to make government smaller, not bigger. Let's talk about what other countries have done. I'm doing okay on time, I hope. Hong Kong is a big success story. You go back, 60 plus years, and year after year, decade after decade, Hong Kong grows 5 to 6% a year. They've gone from being one of the poorest places in the world to being one of the richest places in the world. They routinely rank at the top in the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, as well as the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom. And one thing they have in terms of fiscal policy is they have Article 107 of their basic law, which is their constitution. Now, ironically, Hong Kong has never been independent. It was ruled by the British until 1997, and it's been ruled by Beijing ever since. But both Britain and Beijing have, by and large, left Hong Kong alone with regards to domestic policy. And so Hong Kong has this Article 107 of their basic law, and it explicitly stipulates that government spending should not consume more than 20% of GDP, and it explicitly says that government shouldn't grow faster than GDP. So obviously, if you have government a little bit under 20% of GDP, in order to keep that target, you need to make sure government isn't growing faster than GDP, and that system has worked. But and we had Hong Kong's High Commissioner at a Capitol Hill forum at one of the programs we sponsored at Cato, and listening to him and talking to him privately, I sort of wonder whether or not it's because of Article 107 or simply because Hong Kong policymakers are more sensible than other policymakers. Because what would happen if Beijing wanted them to spend more? They'd probably spend more. What if they wanted to spend more? They might spend more. Let's look at what I think might be the best model of all, which is the Swiss debt brake. This was imposed by nearly 85% of Swiss voters back in 2001. And in effect, what it is, you could think of it as a business cycle balanced budget amendment. But in practical terms, what it really does is it says politicians, year in, year out, can increase government by 2% a year. So if you have a recession and your revenues fall, well, you can still increase government spending 2% a year. But what you can't do, and this is really critical, when the economy is growing and your revenues are coming in 8% a year or something like that, guess what? You can still increase government spending only 2% a year. So I think the Swiss debt brake is very politically sustainable. obviously, you could make government bigger by doing tax hikes, but you have to pass those in a referendum in Switzerland, and the Swiss people are relatively sensible. They don't like that idea. And so what we've seen is ever since the debt brake went into effect, government spending has shrank. I never understand how to say that, but it's fallen as a share of GDP. I'll keep it very simple. So while the rest of Europe is spiraling into more debt, bigger government, more stagnation, Switzerland has such a strong economy and such a good fiscal situation that investors literally are paying the Swiss government to hold their bonds, which is rather remarkable. There's also Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is actually a limit on revenues, which combined with the balanced budget requirement means it's actually a limit on spending. Of all the proposals, I know the least about Tabor, but it's been relatively successful. How do I know it's been successful? Because the spending lobbies hate it, and they are always going to the ballot with referendums to try to spend more money. They actually succeeded this last November when they had a referendum to spend some of the marijuana legalization revenue that came through. So as a libertarian, I like the idea of legalizing marijuana, but I hate the idea that politicians get more money to spend as a result. So I have mixed feelings on that. Let's go ahead and phase out because I'm running out of time. There are a few spending cap proposals in Washington, D.C., including Congressman Brady from here in Texas has one. Although I actually think the Swiss debt brake would be the best model, and I'm working with a couple of offices to try to push that. Here's what I think should be the guiding light. My buddy Art Laffer is famous for the Laffer curve. I'm trying to make myself famous with my golden rule. But I think the golden rule, notwithstanding my name, is a very good policy. Because if government is too big and you're worried about it getting even bigger in the future, you simply need to make sure that it grows slower than the private sector. And this does two wonderful things. It makes politicians think, how can we get the private sector to grow faster? And it forces them to have government grow slower. So two very good things in one rule, where if you simply have a balanced budget rule, you might, as I said before, lead them simply to raise taxes. So the lessons are pretty clear. Limit total outlays other than interest, and that's what public finance wonks call primary spending. Make the cap part of the Constitution so it's hard to change. I already mentioned that the BCA has been violated twice, and it's not even that good of a cap to begin with. And then make the plan reasonable so that voters and therefore politicians would find it difficult to change anyhow. And that's why I like the Swiss debt brake. They're not forced to cut spending in a recession when they're, of course, extremely reluctant to be fiscally prudent, but they're not allowed to spend more money when the economy is doing well. And that, I think, is really the key to a good spending cap. If we don't do it, this is the result. The result for Texas, the result for the United States, the result for France, for Greece. If you have too few taxpayers and two people trying to ride in the wagon of government dependency, sooner or later, the system breaks down. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Our final speaker is Senator Van Taylor. He's a dedicated family man, successful businessman, and decorated Marine officer. As a Marine officer and paratrooper, Captain Taylor volunteered for duty as a platoon commander with the Marine Corps C Company, 4th Renaissance Battalion. For his service in Iraq, Captain Taylor was awarded the Combat Action Ribbon, Presidential Unit Citation, and the Navy Commendation Medal with a V for Valor. Since elected to the Texas Legislature in 2010, Taylor has consistently fought to limit the size and reach of government, rein in spending, lower taxes, protect the rainy day fund, and stop the expansion of Obamacare in Texas. For his commitment to conservative principles, Taylor has earned the Taxpayer Champion Award from the Texas for Fiscal Responsibility, Courageous Conservative Award for Texas Conservative Coalition, was named a top-rated conservative by Texas Eagle Forum and selected to the honor roll by the Young Conservatives of Texas, and received an A rating from the National Rifle Association. In the Texas Senate, Senator Taylor was named Vice Chairman of the Nominations Committee and also appointed to serve on the Education, Health and Human Services and Transportation Committee. Please welcome Senator Van Taylor.
Thank you, Talmadge. And Ursula, that was a terrific taxonomy on a very difficult subject. You did a great job, and Dr. Mitchell, thank you for being here. Great to be with all of you here today. Being a conservative, I like to begin with a few quotes from my hero, Ronald Reagan. As soon as we get this slide up here, but I'll just read it off to you. You've probably heard this one, Ronald Reagan, great statement. Government is like a baby, an alimentary canal with a big appetite on one end and no sense of responsibility on the other. Another famous Reagan comment, we have $1 trillion debt, not because we haven't taxed enough, we have $1 trillion debt because we spend too much. And finally, this is probably the most important thing that I can say as a conservative, as government expands, liberty contracts. The more money that government takes out of our pocket, the less freedom we have in our everyday lives. And I went to Harvard College. I spent quite a bit of time at the Institute of Politics. And I remember when Paul Tsongas, he was the governor of Massachusetts, his sister came and spoke at IOP, and we're in a small group setting, and I asked her, she said, we need to be courageous, and there are some governors out there that are courageous, and they're expanding government, and they're spending more money, and we've got to be brave, we need these new programs. And I said, look, today, federal spending is 22% of GDP. It used to be 18%. How much is enough? And her answer was, I don't know, but we need more. And that is what ultimately concerns me. When you look at total government spending in 2000, it was 38% of the U.S. economy. In 2013, it was 43%. It keeps going up and up and up. We are on the track to being a socialist country, where half of every dollar goes to government. And when government decides what to spend, we're not deciding what we spend. We lose our freedom and our identity to make decisions about our own lives. And with that, I like to say, debt and taxes are symptoms, but spending is the disease. Spending is the disease. And I think when you look at, and I'll just give you one other number set here, and that is looking at the federal, and I have a really nifty Heritage Foundation chart, which I'd love to show you here in a second. But if you look at, in 1970, the average American family, this is adjusted in real dollars, federal spending was $14,000. In 2014, it was $28,000. And in 2025, it'll be $39,000. So federal spending per family in real dollars keeps going up and up and up and up. And this is, again, taking away our freedom and our identity and our ability to control our daily lives. Texas has done a substantially better job in controlling its spending. And part of that is because of the budget controls that we have in place, and I'll get to that in a second, and part of it is because of the system that we've set up for that. But in 2000, as a percentage of our state GDP, it was 5%, but in the 2012-2013 budget, it was 7% of GDP. So it is, state spending in Texas as a percentage of GDP continues to go up. In the control that we have today, the big constraint, as Ursula puts it, is on the percentage of income that is, here we go. Let me just quickly take you through, okay. So here are my Reagan comments. You could see here in 2000, the total expenditure, look at the far right-hand column, from going up from 38% to 43%, but you could see across the board, whether it's federal spending, state spending, local spending, it keeps going up. And this is the Heritage Foundation chart I was telling you about earlier, where you're watching per family real dollar spending by the federal government goes up and up and up. A projected 55-year increase of 166%. It just keeps going up. And then you can see in Texas, where we have done a better job of controlling spending and reining it in, you can still see as a percentage of GDP, total spending for state government in Texas, a percent of our state GDP continues to go up, which is frustrating for me as a conservative. I'd like to see that capped. So you want to see a cap, and we do have several caps. My concern with capping it only with personal GDP or with population plus inflation is you can go into an environment where you have population increasing, but your GDP is stagnating. I'll take you to Los Angeles, California. Between 1980 and 2010, the city of Los Angeles, over that 30-year period, added 1 million in population and lost 200,000 jobs. So just because you're adding population and there is inflation doesn't mean that your economy is growing as well, which is why I think you need to have a multi-system type spending limit, some of what Talmadge was talking about earlier. The other keys to this are having smaller government, fewer regulations, less public debt, and the spending caps need to limit future legislators. My concern here, though, and what I will say is that while on one hand you want to control what the legislature does, on the other hand, there are plenty of opportunities. State government is very complicated and very large. State government in Texas spends over $100 billion a year. In California, I'll throw them under the bus here for a second, which is not too hard to do. They have, so our state gas tax is 20 cents a gallon. Their state gas tax is 50 cents a gallon. Between 2002 and 2012, Texas built 5,700 lane miles of state highway. California built 11. Okay, not 100 or 1,000, 11. Okay, so they're not building roads in California. So they're politicians. So the next question should be, well, wait a minute. They've got a really high gas tax. They actually have the second highest gas tax in the country. And they're not spending it on roads, so where's the money going? Well, 36% of the welfare recipients in America are in California, which only has 12% of the U.S. population. So just because you've got revenue coming in, and just because you have balanced budget requirements doesn't mean that you're actually spending stuff on core functions of government like transportation. Another classic place for liberals to go and raid state dollars, if they want to, is to not invest in their pension funds. Texas this session, we took one of our pension funds, we made it actuarially sound. If you look at the state of California, they've actually had 2 cities already go bankrupt because they weren't properly funding their pension funds. They have serious problems with pension funds, particularly the more liberal the state, the more difficult the problems they have with their pension funds. You look at the city of Chicago, there's an estimate that every man, woman, and child in the city of Chicago owes $20,000 to make good on their pension funds. They don't have the money to do that. Even with the spending limit, what ultimately makes these things work are the voters. And I will use an example of where I personally have used the spending limit to restrain spending in the state of Texas. So if you go back to August of 2012, there was a meeting of state House members. I was a House member at the time. And there was a discussion by some very senior House members of busting the spending cap. We're going to go into the next session in the beginning of 15. We're going to bust the cap. We're going to spend a couple extra $1 billion. I worked with my staff, did some research, got several other state senators, Senators Hall, Senator Burton, and Senator Creighton, and we wrote a joint editorial saying we do not think that we should bust the spending cap. And I had several private conversations with different state leaders, and ultimately the decision was no, we're not going to bust the spending cap. The important thing about the spending cap was a mechanism and an important mechanism, but ultimately it was a political mechanism where the voters, and that was the real fear, the politicians feared the voters, and the voters could understand that busting the cap was bad. It was something that was simple, it was easy, it was crisp, and they could get it and quickly decide we're not going to do that. I was grateful, Van Taylor was grateful as a senator that was in place because it allowed us to change the trajectory of the state and change the spending trajectory that we had. And I'll just give a little, so these are, I filed last session Senate Bill 403, which was a spending cap. It tied spending to the rate of population and inflation, or the rate of growth in Texas gross state product. Again, going back to what happened in LA, population plus inflation is important, but GDP is important as well as a metric. And this would be in addition to the spending cap that we already have right now, which is based around increases in revenue. SB 404, a bill I filed requiring state agencies to plan for 1%, 5%, and 10% spending cuts. This is a way to make them more efficient, leaner. This is actually borrowed from Mayor Rudy Giuliani when he was mayor of New York. He had all his agencies do this. He found it was very, very successful. Finally, something else I'm still working on, SJR 37, which I filed last session. There is a pretty substantial question of what the state of Texas should do when our rainy day fund is finally constitutionally full. I think the spending cap, Ursula, $16 billion, is the cap today, and it'll go up another $2 billion next session. But as we continue to make deposits like we did last week or 2 weeks ago into the rainy day fund, it keeps getting fuller. So at some point it will be full, and the question is, what do you do with those excess revenues? My thought was to use those to make sure that our pensions funds in Texas are fiscally solvent. But there were other ideas. Chairman Otto carried a bill to use it to pay down debt. So there's a lot of discussion about what do you do with the ESF revenue stream to do fiscally conservative things like making sure your pension funds are full, making sure your debt's paid off. Another idea that Talmadge has is using it for tax relief, which I believe is a very conservative use for it. And in conclusion, I'm just going to say that unlike these other people who I have to get reelected, so I'm going to cite a timeless political proverb: "Blessed are the brief, for they shall be reelected." Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Senator. While you're thinking about your questions, I would ask you, when you are asking your question, get to a question pretty quickly if you can, and please wait on the mic to get to you so that we can record your comments. I'd like to get a response from the panel. If you're paying attention to tax and expenditure limits as a whole, a big number, do you run the risk, and I think, Senator, you hit on this a little bit, do you run the risk of allowing runaway spending with certain agencies or on certain programs? Could you all respond to that? And also, have you seen any examples of that?
I'll simply make the point that if you have a spending cap that only covers certain portions of a budget, like we have with the BCA in Washington, then even if the BCA is effective and sustainable, which it hasn't been, it still doesn't solve the problem of entitlement. So that's why I had in my presentation that a spending cap should cover what's called primary spending, be comprehensive. And one thing I didn't mention that I should have is when you talk to people in Hong Kong and Switzerland about what changes in terms of political dynamics, the interest groups begin to fight each other. And we actually saw this a little bit with the BCA and a little bit with Graham-Rudman. But in Switzerland and Hong Kong, whenever some interest group comes into the government and says, we want more money for our program, the government then says back to them, well, given the rules, we have to take that money from someone else. Can you identify the other interest group we should take the money from? And that creates a very healthy political dynamic where different interest groups are in effect saying, well, they're not spending the money as well as we would spend it, but everything's happening within sort of the global cap on total non-interest spending. And I think that's, if I had one lesson that I've learned from what these other countries have done, that change in the political dynamic is very, very effective.
I think one thing that I would say about that is that, and the case of highway funding, I think is sort of relevant here, and I think everybody's touched on highway funding, is that our primary means for funding highways is the State Highway Fund, and we're really in a place right now where the State Highway Fund is going to be controlled by neither the spending nor the pay-as-you-go limit. So in terms of funding TxDOT, it's going to be sort of outside, that kind of conversation that you're talking about, about those sort of competing interests, which I think is an interesting dynamic. I think that this does, though, also kind of get back to, these decisions about, relative funding demands, are in fact made by the elected members of the legislature. And I do trust that body, to represent their districts and vote their districts and make good decisions on that and to balance those interests out. And I think they've, the record shows that happens. But I do think we do have certain pockets of the state budget, that are more strongly affected by the limitations that we have in place than others.
I'll just say from my own time in the legislature, when interest groups comes in and says, I want you to spend more money on this or that, my response is, well, who do you want me to take it from? And the invariable response is, I don't know, but I just need the money. So, but that is an effective response of, okay, well, where should I mean, because even if you're going to take the money by higher taxes, okay, well, which group should I tax and why should I take their money from them? Sometimes it's interesting, people often see government as just sort of money that comes from nowhere, but it doesn't. Money comes from us, from the people.
An observation of mine over the last 30 years is, Ursula, you mentioned TxDOT. TxDOT is a good example. They've had dedicated funding for a number of years. And I think when the legislature looks at the budget, they would look at TxDOT and say, well, you've got dedicated funding, and they didn't open the envelope and see how they were actually spending their money. And I think we found that they were spending some money maybe not as effectively as they should. And so I think the dedication causes the legislature to look at less scrutiny of that, which is not a healthy situation, in my opinion. Questions from the audience? Right here.
Hey, thank you all for today. This has really been interesting. Tax and expenditure limits matter in a way with state government, but there's a lot of things the state government's on the hook for with Prop 12, Prop 14, with highways, CPRIT, capital appreciation bonds, I believe, factor into this, as well as chapter, I think it's 303 with schools. A lot of that is like shifting money back and forth. And how does like sort of kicking the can down the road going to impact if there's like expenditure or tax limits? Because that comes in a little bit later or from a different angle. I think that's kind of how I view it or have seen it.
So
Panel?
in 2011, my first session in the House, Chairman Joe Pickett from El Paso stood up on the floor of the House and pointed out that that was the first year in the history of the state of Texas that more money would be spent servicing debt for transportation than actually spent on building new roads. And that really pointed to me the problem with using debt. I mean, government should generally, take in and spend. It should not use lots and lots of debt. And when you use lots and lots of debt, you end up in a situation where Texas is with state highway. What's interesting is, I mean, the federal government is well past that on some levels. So I think you're making a good point. Just for this fiscal conservative, it's important that Texas not kick the can down the road, that we have a decent savings account, that we properly fund our pension funds, that we are paying for transportation, not with debt, but with cash flow, and that we're not using some accounting gimmickry to increase spending and then put that burden on future taxpayers. I think that's something that I very much recognize, and I think you'll see this legislature, and I think as the state continues to be more conservative, I'm very confident that the next legislature will be even more conservative than this one, that you'll see us continue to put things in the right places. That is to say, fund our pension funds, fund the four core functions of government without using debt and accounting gimmicks to do it.
Other comments?
Just one thing I would say to that, and that I think you're kind of touching on, that I do think is important, is actually a question I had on some of the international analysis you were presenting, is different states and certainly different countries have really different relationships of their state spending to their local spending. And so the roles that cities and counties and school districts and hospital districts and community college districts and all of these different entities that have their own taxing jurisdictions locally and have their own responsibilities, and sometimes those are shared responsibilities with the state, that when we talk about what the appropriate role of state spending is and the way in which we want to limit it to be responsible stewards of state funding, and I think it is important to think about, okay, is there going to be a local ramification to that choice? Are we making a choice right now that might affect, what hospital districts have to do in order to handle their local communities, or that school districts have to do, or cities or counties? And we hear about this back and forth. And those are just really different dynamics, I think, state to state, and even within the state, actually. We've got so many different jurisdictions that have that kind of authority. And I think that it is a component of what we're talking about.
Other questions? Right here. Wait on the mic if you would, please, sir.
The
Texas pension plans, are they defined contribution or defined benefit?
By and large, they are defined benefit. The county pension system is sort of a hybrid of defined contribution that's then converted into defined benefit. So, but we have, relatively speaking, very fiscally sound or financially solvent pension funds. And again, the legislature is working toward making them more solvent and more sound for the future, and not using them as a piggy bank to increase spending and then put that burden on future generations.
I don't know that I have anything to add to that, except to say that one of the interesting features of the Texas Constitution is that we put a lot of stuff in the Texas Constitution, including to some degree, the rates of contribution into these pension systems, is something else that is constitutionally driven, not just statutory.
It's interesting to note that one of the programs, which is a defined contribution optional retirement program, was requested by the university several years ago so they could use it as a recruiting tool, and so that they didn't, when they brought a professor in of national renown, that they didn't get trapped with their pension system, and so they've used that effectively for that over the years. What we find, I think, though, is not so clean when you get down to cities. We have some cities that are not in nearly as good a situation. They have spent their money instead of putting it in the pension system to where they are in trouble, and most of those, in fact, all of them that I'm aware of, are defined benefit. Other questions? Back here.
As Medicaid continues to grow be the fastest growing component of the state budget, are the spending caps that were discussed last session, like SB 9, would those contain Medicaid growth as well, considering that that's a federal program, or would Medicaid be separate from what we've been talking about?
So most of the proposals that have been discussed around adjusting the spending limit and the way it works currently is that, as I noted, they're sort of agnostic about how you're spending the money. There is one proposal that I'm aware of, and there may be others. I don't want to pretend to know everything that was out there. But something that was discussed on the House side with respect to Senate Bill 9 would have these differential rates of inflation for different parts of the state budget. So that there would be something that was specific to, medical inflation, something specific to, how education costs grow, something specific to how transportation costs grow. Now, again, I think similar to what Senator Taylor was talking about, these would be limits, I think that they were envisioned as being in addition to the current ones, and would kind of have to work in concert. So it would be an additional statutory limit that would work that way. And that's the one piece that I'm aware of that would look at different functions in that way.
Obviously, I don't know the details of the Texas budgeting with Medicaid, but I will say something about Medicaid, why rules matter. The way Medicaid works, it's a matching program where the feds kick in some and the states kick in some, and some of it is optional for the states. But here's the thing: if you're a federal politician and you want to expand Medicaid, well, it's a good deal for you because you can give away $1 of goodies from the federal government, but the federal government's share of it is maybe 60 cents or whatever, depending on the different state formulas. Likewise, if you're on the state level, and if the federal government has some optional part of Medicaid, or for that matter, if they're simply talking about expanding it in Washington, you might think that's a good deal because it might only cost you or your taxpayers 30 or 40 cents per dollar of goodies being delivered. And so when politicians at the federal and state levels get to give away $1 and pay less than $1, I think it creates a bad dynamic. And one of the good things about the Medicaid reform that's part of the entitlement reform packages that are being debated in Washington, it would do with Medicaid what happened under Bill Clinton with welfare, just block grant it to the states and then give the states total flexibility about how they want to deal with it. Now, there still might be some problems within the spending cap because those entitlement reforms in Washington assume that the Medicaid block grant would grow at, I think, GDP plus 1%. which might then still allow more spending than a cap, and I don't know whether it would be within the Texas spending cap, but it probably would be over the Colorado Tabor spending cap. But that kind of entitlement reform in Washington would make the job of states easier. Whereas if you just have this federal mandate, federal entitlement, then you're sort of just dragged along by the bad policy out of Washington.
Other questions? You got a good panel here. It's the last, getting close to the end of a time to answer, right here in the back. No, please use the mic.
Oh, there it is. Okay. I've been in Texas this time for about 28 years, and I agree with you. Texas is doing a pretty good job of fulfilling, the legislature's doing a pretty good job of fulfilling the voters' interests and watching out for their interests from state government. Might it be time for you to start taking a look at county government? County government is a big taxation source on me. And I know county government, I think of county government as the retail end of state government. They deliver much of state law to the residents of the state. Yet many people in state government, county government, suffer from the disease of wanting to have monuments named after them, want to have people think of them as wonderful guys. They opened this expo center for our kids can have farm shows in it, like my county does. And they subsidize it by $1 million a year because it has never broken even. That's the sort of burden that is beginning to affect me much more so than state government. I'm pretty satisfied with state government, so perhaps you all need to take a look at the retail branch of state government and think about putting some real strong spending controls on them.
Any observations from the panel on that?
Well, again, I appreciate your compliments to the legislature, but, right back at you, the legislature's performance is a direct reflection of the voters. I mean, the voters are picking people. I mean, and there's a market of ideas. I mean, in the political races I've been in, there are different ideas on how to run the state, and the voters are consistently picking more and more conservative people to come that want to spend less money, return government to its core functions. And so I would hope, I think that people ultimately get the government that they vote for. And I would hope that someone like you, if you're very interested in changing your county, I really think it's incumbent on you to get out there and maybe give your first campaign pitch right there.
Yes.
I just mentioned how Medicaid is a federal program and states sort of get sucked up into it. Well, the same thing, if from what you describe it, if state government policy is such that the counties are basically administrators of state government law and state government programs, then the real issue should be how do you properly decentralize? And I mentioned Switzerland's debt break. Well, Switzerland's also a good role model on genuine decentralization and genuine federalism. There's very little redistribution within the cantons, and 70% of government spending in Switzerland is still at the canton and municipal level. So they actually, their constitution was modeled on ours, but they've actually honored our constitution because they still have a small central government, and most things are done at the as I said, canton and municipal level. And the municipalities, they by and large are responsible for raising and spending their own money without dictates from the cantons. And the cantons raise and spend their own money without dictates from Bern. So if you're going to have a decentralized system, which is very, very good, people then are responsible. Okay, in our local community, are we going to decide to tax ourselves to have this expo center? But if you think that you can get the money from Austin, or for that matter from Washington, then you just have bad incentives. So the rules really do matter. And I suppose, since we're coming to the end, one thing I didn't mention about rules, which is really remarkable, the International Monetary Fund and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development are both international bureaucracies, and they both unquestionably lean to the left, so they're not usually sources I would cite. But when in separate studies, both the OECD and IMF looked at budget rules around the world, and they concluded that the only things that actually work, not balanced budget rules, not Maastricht rules, not deficit rules, not debt rules, but expenditure limits. So when everyone from the Cato Institute on one end of the spectrum to the OECD and the IMF on the other end of the spectrum agree that expenditure limits are the only things that work, I think that's probably a pretty good sign that expenditure limits are the only thing that work.
One of the things, Ursula mentioned that one of the limits on spending at the state level is indebtedness. And we find that Texas does pretty good in that area. But if you look at Texas as a whole, local and state, we're number 2 behind New York in total indebtedness. Most of that debt load you'll find at the local level. And that is something that needs to be, we are beginning to pay attention to the local governments, and we hopefully will see more of an impact on that in years to come. One last question. Do we have another question? If not, thank you very much for being here today. I hope that you've come to see that whether you believe that government should be doing more or less, there needs to be limits on what they are doing, and they need to prioritize. And whether we have it right or not, you're to be the judge of that. But I hope you will watch the legislative process through the interim as they have their interim hearings to look and see what they're talking about and how it will have an impact on future budgets. If you would, please help me thank the panel. Our meeting's concluded. Thank you very much.